Thank you very much. Okay, so it's great to be here today, and just get this set here. Uh, Dominic and I are both very excited to be participating in Daylight Awareness Week, giving some examples of the central role that daylight plays in the lives of people in Vanuatu. So first of all, for those of you who are not sure where Vanuatu is located, we're talking about the Pacific Ocean Basin, which is a vast area of the Earth covering nearly a third of its surface. And spread across this vast expanse are some 25,000 islands, most rather small. And despite the small land masses, these islands are home to about 25% of the Earth's languages, which is a reflection of their immense cultural diversity. Vanuatu is an island chain in the Southwest Pacific region known as Melanesia. The country is formed from about 80 islands, and it has a total population of about 300,000 people. Its landmass is rather small, just over 12,000 square kilometers, so it's about the size of the US state of Connecticut, or maybe just a bit smaller than Northern Ireland or Montenegro. But in this small country, there are 138 different indigenous languages, making it the most language-dense country in the world per capita. Vanuatu also retains many aspects of its traditional cultures, which are, as we say, biodiversity dependent. This means that the majority of people depend on biodiversity for things like food and water security, lodging, clothing, medicines, traditional transports like canoes, and customary practices. But traditional stewardship of these resources has helped to maintain intact environments. But environmental degradation is now leading to not only losses in biodiversity, but also cultural erosion, as well as increased vulnerabilities and dependencies. Dominic and I represent a small part of a much bigger program which we call Plants and People of Vanuatu, which is a collaboration of local and international partners working to document Vanuatu's plant diversity, help preserve traditional language, traditional plant-based knowledge, including languages and cultural beliefs, to understand and conserve and restore Vanuatu's forest habitats, and to build local capacity. Today, we'll focus on just a few aspects of our work, the ones that are relevant to this week's Daylight Awareness theme, and in particular to the relationship between the sun, people, and plants. The sun, as well as the moon, daylight, and seasons affect every aspect of the people's lives in Vanuatu. And here we see people from Mythologies standing in front of one of several ancient petroglyphs on the island that are called the walking sun because the sun has two legs. Ancestors within living memory of these two men had elaborate rituals to worship the sun. Most of the examples that Dominic and I will give today come from the southernmost islands of Vanuatu, especially the islands of Tana and Mythologies. But I'll also mention a few from nearby Futuna, as well as from Pentecost, which is farther north in the archipelago. In our talk, we'd like to give examples from both daily and seasonal cycles. On a daily basis, just about every activity in people's lives is closely tied to daylight, especially since electricity is generally lacking in most villages. Some of these are to be expected, rising in the morning, going to bed at night, eating meals, and so on. But I'll discuss one example with a particular connection to the sun, that is, the communal drinking of kava. Throughout Vanuatu, kava preparation and drinking generally occurs in special gathering places known as nakamals. And these three photos provide examples of different styles of nakamals found on 3 different islands. In southern Vanuatu, kava preparation is precisely timed to ensure that drinking occurs just before sunset, and there's a specific reason for this. I'll start by explaining the story of Tamafa from Tana. In Tana, men and boys from the village gather together in the late afternoon to prepare kava, which takes about an hour to an hour and a half. Before drinking begins, there's time for what they call small talk, or the exchanging of reports, after which the first shells of kava are drunk. As the first drinkers drink, they reserve a small amount of kava liquid in their mouth and then ritually spray it onto the ground usually uttering a statement or a prayer. This is called tamafa, and it signifies that the reports that have all been agreed to or sealed by those present. And all of this must happen before the sun sets. And that's because tamafa is directly connected to the sun and day length. The idea is that as the sun crosses over the island from east to west, it gathers up the reports that are offered from each nakamal. Then the sun sets behind a great rock just off the southwestern coast of Tanna. And as it sets, the sun stamps or seals the report on the rock, and people say they can actually feel the earth move as the sun stamps the rock. If the report was bad for any given garden, the gardener probably did something wrong, and as a result, his crops won't grow well there. Just to the south, on the island of Vanuatu, kava drinking ceremonies were largely suppressed by some of the early missionary groups. But the story of tamafa has been retained, and in many ways it's more elaborate than the explanation from Tanna. In Vanuatu, people belong to particular tribes, often dedicated to particular crops, say yams or taro, banana, or kava. And so each afternoon before sunset, people from each tribe would gather together in their special nakamals reserved for their tribe. Just as on Tanna, they would make reports among themselves, discussing what was going on in their gardens. And just before sunset, the chief of the nakamal would make a tamafa, that is, the spit spray, after drinking his first shell of kava, because in their language, the word tamafa means, what we seal, we stand for. So he effectively seals or stamps the report. In Vanuatu, the significance of this is directly related to the sun, moon, and stars, as well as to people's everyday lives. Their belief is that the setting sun receives these tamafa reports and carries them on its back like cargo. After the sun sets, it then delivers these reports over to the moon, which then rises and crosses the sky. At night, the moon then delivers the report over to the Pleiades star cluster. And sometime before daylight, the Pleiades star cluster relays this message back to the Earth or the ground. And then the Earth can adjust local conditions, such as rain, sun, temperature, or wind, to improve the environment for their gardens. So there's a very direct connection between people's daily activities and their beliefs about the sun. And this is just one example of these daily cycles, but I'd like to switch over now and talk about some yearly cycles. Because Vanuatu is in the tropics, seasonal differences in day lengths are quite small. There are only about 2 hours difference between the longest day in December and the shortest day in June, 6 months later. Compare that to 6 hours difference here in New York, or 7.5 hours difference in Zurich. Temperature differences are also very small, with daily averages differing by only about 4 degrees Celsius between the hottest and coolest months. Rainfall differences are more pronounced, but even in the driest months of the year, rainfall is really quite still heavy and comparable to what we would have in New York. And because these differences are so small and happen gradually over many months, it can be difficult to perceive and track them. Even so, these changes have significant impacts on annual cycles of planting and harvesting crops, hunting birds and marine life, building homes, and planning traditional ceremonies. So one way people in Vanuatu detect such subtle seasonal changes is by using plant cues. Plants have sophisticated methods of perceiving environmental changes. For example, they have a series of photoreceptive proteins which absorb colors or energy of different wavelengths, and this allows them to measure changes in day lengths. That in turn helps them to regulate their activities, ranging from daily or circadian rhythms all the way to yearly cycles. Yearly cycles of events such as germination and flowering, fruit production, and leaf fall are called phenology. And plant phenologies provide important cues for events and activities in people's lives. We call these ecological calendar plants. So, for example, when this species of tree makes its flower, People in Aneityum know that hermit crabs are greasy, which means they're nutritious and good for harvesting. And when this tree flowers, people in Tana know it's a good time to plant kava. In other words, there's a strong relationship between the natural cycles of wild plant phenologies and important events in people's lives in Vanuatu. We can break these cues down into different categories. For example, there are cues for the changes of seasons. Here, the flowering of 3 different plants signals, plant species signals that the cool season is just about to start. And as we go through different examples, I'll list not only the plant species, but also the language areas, which represent distinct cultures, and the plant phenological event. In this case, there's 3 different plant species from 3 different language areas, all flowering. There are also cues related to the annual cyclone season. So, for example, if citrus or mango trees produce more fruits than normal, it's a sign that a severe cyclone will come during the next season. Some plants provide signals for when what people should do in their gardens. Here we see cues for when people should brush or clear a new garden, and notice that many of them are correlated to forest trees losing their leaves. And other plants provide signals for when to plant kumala, or sweet potato, or when to harvest it. Likewise, there are forest trees that provide signals for when to plant taro, and others for when to harvest taro, and when to plant yams, and when to harvest them. There are even plants that provide cues on when to hunt animals. So, for example, when this small plant makes its yellow flowers, turtles are nutritious and good to hunt. In the same way, when screw pines or pandanus trees shed their pollen, it's a good time to catch saltwater fish. And when this tree makes its flower, it's the best time to catch eels from freshwater rivers. Flying foxes, which are large fruit bats, can also be important sources of protein, but people only hunt them at particular seasons, and in South Tana and Futuna, flying foxes are tied to the season when certain trees make their flowers or fruits. In Aneityum, lobsters are only harvested when the leaves of this tree turn red. But lobster harvest in Tana is forbidden, or taboo, when this tree's fruits turn red. Overall, people have a profound respect for seasons, both for hunting and for refraining from hunting. This seasonal respect is a vital aspect of natural resource management, but unfortunately these practices are currently being eroded through the influence of globalization. Now, so far with these ecological calendar plants, we've been talking about specific human activities tied to individual plant species. But there are also more comprehensive systems of reckoning the passage of time each year in Vanuatu. These traditional nature-based calendars help guide people through their annual cycles of activities. They're similar to our calendars, stretching from January to December, but in Vanuatu they're more directly connected to local annual cycles. So in North Tana, all the months describe activities that should happen in their gardens. When to clear the ground, when to plant their crops, when to check them, when to harvest them, and so forth. In North Tana, yams are important, but other crops such as taro are also included in their calendar. And notice that the names of the months explain or signify what happens at that time of year. So in June and July, which are reckoned as the first 2 months in their year, people would clear or brush the gardens. And that's precisely what the names of those months mean. In the calendar of South Tana, each month focuses only on yams in their gardens, reflecting the greater importance of yams in the people's lives from this area. If we move well north in Vanuatu to Pentecost Island, their calendar reflects not only yam, but also the red flowers of a local tree species which they call rara. And in addition to plant cues, people here also use the highly predictable arrival of the pololo worm, which they call udu, to help calibrate their annual calendars. And notice that the 3 months, September, October, and November, are named, at least in part, after the udu. My last example comes from the southernmost island of Aneityum. Here, yams, forest trees, and palola worms are completely absent from their calendar. Instead, all the months involve the phenologies of different kinds of grasses, including bamboo, sugarcane, and another grass they call wild cane. And it's interesting that Anaichum is the only island where construction of traditional houses depends almost solely on grasses. They use no palm leaves for thatching their roofs. Also, notice that the last 3 months have names, but their meanings were not known. Since we first collected this information, we've managed to complete this calendar, but it took several years to find the few people left who had the information to explain these last 3 months. These days, this kind of knowledge is being lost at a very rapid rate. Okay, so next up, my colleague Dr. Dominic Ramick will discuss some other very ingenious ways that people on Tanna Island calibrate yearly cycles. So I'll turn it back. I think Dominic's going to join us by video.
Thank you, Greg. I'm now going to follow up on what you said about the annual cycles and the Tanna Temawa story to present a concrete example of how the sun is used in timekeeping on Tanna Island. In the annual cycles, the solstices correlate with the turning points of the season, indicating the shortest, coldest days in June, when the traditional yam gardens, most important type of gardens, begin their planting cycle. The December solstice, on the other hand, marks the arrival of the hottest and wettest month, the final run of the yam gardens, when the yam tubers grow into the fullest. Ceremonies are performed by the garden magicians, and cyclones arrive too. So the solstice is marking the beginning of the most vulnerable period of the garden cycle. It is therefore very important for the people on Tanna to keep track of the solstices. Different cultures developed different methods of tracking the solstice. The sunrise and sunset positions are among the most common indicators. This is where the importance of nakamals becomes apparent. Very few elders on our island still practice the ancient tradition where they drink the kava just before the sunset and then sit in their favorite spot in the nakamal and watch the sun setting. Each day, they watch the sun set behind a particular tree near the nakamal or even further out on the horizon. They remember the trees and pay special attention to the trees that mark the return of the sun, effectively the solstice points, and also the midpoint that marks the equinox. The March equinox marks the time when the yam harvest happens, and great traditional ceremonies associated with it too. All periods of the turning points have their traditional names. In a sense, this is a living plant-based equivalent of Stonehenge, and this practice of a plant-based solar current calendar in South Vanuatu has, to our knowledge, never been documented or published. Even on our island, Tanna, this practice is little known, and its knowledge is disappearing among the people and may disappear completely in the next generation. Of course, trees don't stay in the landscape forever. This method is also very personal, as it requires a very precise vantage point from the nakamal to work. Like most aspects of life on Tanna, this does not leave any permanent, recognizable mark on the landscape, but is ephemeral. In a sense, disappearing with the people who retain the knowledge, which essentially exists on the people's mind. The fact that people use the sun to keep track of time is obvious, but the method of doing it immaterial based on trees is special and shows how easily such techniques can get lost in the archaeological record, for example, and also emphasizes the importance of documenting such sun-related practices. On our island, we are very happy to have been able to help document and preserve this part of our culture through the Daylight Academy funded project. Thank you.
Wonderful. We just had a wonderful presentation by Gregory and Dominic. It is extremely exciting for me as an ethnographer to see the careful documentation of these traditional knowledge. And we would like to invite those of you in the audience to post your questions for Gregory and Dominic. I think today you will be answering the questions for your team. So we would like to give at least one question now, and then we will certainly open to the general questions and answer segment to address both presentations. So while people are still placing questions, we would like to address one already here that says, "Sir, please share, are there any challenges that Vanuatu faces in terms of conserving its plant life and biodiversity?"
That's a great question. I think it's really the center of the research that we're doing there. So what we've detected is that there are these connections between plant life and the diversity of plants, people's lives, their cultures, the activities they do, both on a daily basis and throughout their lives, and also their languages. So these three things are completely connected. So, for example, and this is part of what Dominic was saying too, is so if people stop going into the forest to go hunting or gathering materials to make their house, then they begin to forget about the names of the plants that they're seeing on a regular basis, and then they forget about the uses. Or if something becomes more threatened and rare, then they stop using it, and then the name drops out and the use drops out. So all of the three things are completely connected. And what we're seeing is a very rapid change in culture going on in Vanuatu. So globalized economies are coming in. People are getting more involved in what they call the productive sector, and they're beginning to become less and less involved in these sort of daily activities that their ancestors have been doing for many thousands of years, and they kept alive for until very recently. So I think those three things are very closely connected, and all three of them are being threatened. And I think one thing that's been nice about this project is we have botanists like me, ethnographers like my colleague Mike Balick, and linguistic experts. And so one of the challenges for example, linguists is they go around and they say, well, what's the name for all these trees? But they don't know the species. Whereas the challenge for us as botanists is we don't understand necessarily the linguistic aspects of things. So having this multidisciplinary team of people involved has been very, very helpful. And it's really raised awareness, because I think all of us can see that these changes sometimes happen in a way that people don't perceive them. And it's only, so we'll begin to ask people, do you have a name for this plant? Do you have a use for this plant? And they're like, yeah, we have a name for that, but I don't remember. I have to go ask my grandfather, right? So it's only when people begin to challenge them in terms of what the information is that they begin to, perceive that the information is being lost or that the species are being lost.
Yeah, thank you. That is fascinating, and I think we observe that as a common trend worldwide. And while we still have 2 more minutes before we open to the general questions and answer, you touched on a topic that is extremely interesting to me. You approach the multidisciplinary nature of your research, and we've seen it in Mesoamerica too, in our own research and those of colleagues, that we have these disciplinary lenses that make us look only at some factors. But could you also comment, because I know you work on this, on the role of the traditional keepers of this knowledge as co-researchers, or more than just informers, who have been, what is the role they have played in making sure that we do not misunderstand these emic local mental models?
Sure, that's a great question. So as we said in the beginning, the project is a collaboration and a partnership between researchers from outside of Vanuatu and local experts in Vanuatu. And as you said, we don't really consider them informants. We consider them research partners. And so as we begin to publish the work that we're doing, they are authors and co-authors on papers. And everything about the information that we assemble and gather and publish is vetted by local people. So the information is collected, it's assembled, and then it's brought back to people, and people are asked, is this correct? Is this right? And not only that, but sometimes in Vanuatu in particular, I think this is probably true in many cultures, there's information that's very sensitive and that's only meant to be known by certain people. And so this vetting process also allows people to say, you know what, that's really secret knowledge that we don't want to share with anybody else. So there's a heavy aspect of that as well.
Yeah, that is also a topic, very extremely interesting. Thank you so much for sharing.